A lot of conversations about, you know, these more almost, I guess, American style Highland cattle versus the more square Scottish style. Do you think there's one that outweighs the other? What are the advantages, the disadvantages to both? Is there more of a market for one or the other?
Sure. Yeah, I think actually when it comes to debating between what we'll call American versus is Scottish, you got to throw Canadian in there too, because Canadian is more American-ish.
Sure.
You know, when they came to this continent, they were fitting into different systems, right? It's no different than the Angus and the Hereford. We just haven't changed them as much as like Aberdeen Angus has changed. Our Highlands are still truer to what they look like when they're in Scotland. And I would also argue that there's some stigmatisms that people believe about the cattle in Scotland who haven't been to Scotland to see that aren't true as well. Some misnomers, you know, so people a lot of times think in Scotland that everything is small and square and smaller structure, and that's not true. So when we were over in Scotland in October, we saw animals that had just as big of frames, if not bigger frames, than the cattle we have on our farm and other well-known named farms in the US and Canada.
Right.
So they have just as different style cattle in Scotland as they do in the US.
Interesting. Okay.
So to say things are more American style or Scottish style, I think the biggest thing, what I mean when I say it, is their hip to pins.
Right.
That's probably the only thing that to me is truly completely different. Because in the US, based off of how we're all taught, for those of us that went to school and got an animal science degree or minor like I did, or grew up judging cattle, you judged all breeds, you're looking for that hip to pin angle where those pins to hips are a little more level, the pins are a little bit more, if anything, a little bit higher than the hip when you're looking at it, at least when you show them in the show ring. You loin them and they bring those pins up a little bit. Where when you go look at most of the cattle in Scotland, most of those pins drop down pretty tight. Like there's a significant slope from hips to pins, and that's a structural argument that you could have all day. You know, where there's an American belief, and we get taught this in animal science classes, you know, that when we're calving, that's a better angle to calve at.
The shallower hip to pin angle
Yep.
is a general indicator of calving ease. You've seen that?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we call American, right?
Sure.
And when you look at the more, you know, Scottish style where that hip drops down, you're changing that birth canal. And when you change that birth canal, or in this case, it stays versus what we believe from an American belief, you're just making it quote unquote harder to calve. So that's just a difference. And so when I say Scottish, that's probably Scottish to American. That's how I define it.
Right.
You know, the boxiness and the structure, whether they're a frame size score 2 or they're a frame size score 4, we have them on both sides of the pond.
Yeah, there's a lot of diversity within both.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some very influential animals in the American Highland Cattle Association herd book have both styles, right? We've got some giant animals. So Angus the 8th of Dunvegan, which was a Scottish bull as an import, was said to have an extra rib. He was that long. Now that's I'm sure he had a normal amount of ribs, but that's what they would talk about when they talked about Angus the 8th of Dunvegan, because he was that long.
Right.
Right? And,
yep.
and traditionally how some people might think of Scottish is they might not think that they're that long. Philip of Glengorm's mom is a very long female. She's one of the longest females in Glengorm herd. Actually, that Philip mother reminds me a lot of a cow called Grey Owl's Brita. A super long, very wide-hipped cow, you know, that had a lot of deep in body to her, and is a 1,400-pound cow. Philip's mom is a 1,400-pound cow. And most people would think, oh, they're only 1,200 pounds over in Scotland. And that's not true. They have every frame size in Scotland, just like we have every frame size here in the United States.